As a music producer, Ableton Live has always been my door of choice. I've been using it for 10 years and I've used it for absolutely every release of mine. And I've invested a lot of time into learning the software and understanding how to produce music in Ableton, understanding how to sound design. However, recently I had to compose a cinematic piece of music that was going to be scored by an orchestrator who was going to write up all of the sheet music for me so that it could be performed by live musicians in a professional recording studio. Now, this studio wasn't just any old recording studio, it was Trackdown Studios, which is one of the major recording studios here in Sydney, renowned for recording some of the biggest scores in Hollywood filmmaking. So, this meant that my music had to be taken from my DAW and written up in sheet music so that a string quartet and a brass section could record my parts. And this is where I came across quite a few limitations in Ableton when it came to composing for film. And to be honest, this really sucked because as a music producer, having spent 10 years investing my time and skills into learning a DAW, you don't want to have to change DAWs when you need to do a certain task. For me, I love Ableton and I will always want to continue to compose in Ableton no matter what kind of a project I'm doing. So it really kind of sucked that there were these major limitations in Ableton when it came to screen composition, which I totally understand that Ableton is definitely a door that is geared around electronic music production, not necessarily screen composing. And so I'm not complaining about that. I just wanted to share today some of the limitations that I came across and some of the workarounds that I had to do in order to be able to continue to compose and produce music in Ableton. I will say though, if you are getting into screen composition and you want to use Ableton to compose completely in the box, then you're not going to have any issues with composing in Ableton because you can do all of that. It's only when you need to take your composition outside of Ableton that you're going to come across these limitations. Also, if you haven't seen this composition that I created, I'll leave some links in the description, along with a link to a video of my, full uncut process of how I created the composition in Ableton. And you can check that one out as well. Okay, so let's get into some of the limitations and what I did to work around some of these issues. Limitation number one, Ableton does not have any inbuilt notation software like Logic does and some other programs do. So for me, I created my composition in Ableton and the orchestrator that I was working with worked in Logic Pro. So her process was to take my MIDI files, clean them up, tidy them up so that the score editor was close to correct in interpreting those MIDI notes into notation. And then what she did was transfer that information over to Sibelius. So that was her workflow. So I had to somehow get my MIDI files from Ableton over into Logic. So you might be thinking, well, that's fine. You can just export your MIDI files and give them to her and she can put them into Logic Pro. And yes, that is true. I can just export all of my MIDI files and give them to her to input into Logic Pro so she can do her end of the work. However, this is where I came across limitation number two. So limitation number two is about extracting tempo maps. So when you are creating a composition for film, you're more than likely going to have tempo changes so that you hit certain points of the visuals. And usually with all of these tempo changes, this information gets embedded into a MIDI file in certain DAWs like Logic Pro. If you create tempo changes in Logic Pro and you export a MIDI file, it's going to have that information embedded into the MIDI file. In Ableton, when you export MIDI files from Ableton, it doesn't include like tempo information at all. So if you've done a whole bunch of tempo changes in your Ableton project and you export these MIDI files to give to your orchestrator, the MIDI files are not going to have those tempo changes embedded into them. Now, Ableton does have a workaround to this issue of extracting tempo maps, and I'll leave a link to the article in the description of this video. And I tried actually the suggestions in this article, but none of them actually worked. So to work around this issue, I actually started off in Logic Pro first to set up my session. I imported the film. I did a spotting session to map out different sections of the film. And then I went through and created a basic tempo map. I then chose one tempo that worked overall for the film. So one tempo that pretty much worked for the whole film, because I didn't want to create too many tempo changes. I did create a couple of tempo changes to accommodate hitting certain points of the visuals on the screen, but basically I wanted to keep it very basic and simple for the live musicians to play. So once I mapped out my tempo and I created automation in the tempo, I then created a MIDI file and extended it for the whole duration of the film. I then exported that MIDI file and imported it over into Ableton. And once I did that, the tempo changes were automatically recognized in Ableton because the MIDI file from Logic had all of that information embedded into it. I wanted Ableton to follow the exact tempo changes that I had created in Logic Pro. Now, doing it this way, you actually kind of have to be a little bit final with the decision you make with the tempo changes in Logic Pro, because once you go over to Ableton, you can't really make any more tempo changes in Ableton because, like I said, those tempo changes are not going to be, I guess, recognized on export when you go back over to Logic Pro. So you kind of have to be final in your decision on the tempo changes in Logic Pro once you go to Ableton. I guess if you were to make very minor like tempo changes in Ableton, you could then go back to Logic Pro and manually input that tempo change into Logic Pro. But again, you're just kind of making more work for yourself. So once you go over to Ableton, stick to those tempo changes. Be final in your decision of tempo changes in Logic Pro. So I've got my tempo changes all mapped out in Ableton now, since coming from Logic to Ableton. Once I then created my MIDI mockup, the whole composition and the whole score, I then had to export all of my MIDI files back over into Logic Pro 10. And the reason for this was to prepare the MIDI files for the orchestration stage of the composition. But this is where I came across limitation number 3. So limitation number 3 is all about exporting MIDI from Ableton and getting those MIDI files to line up in the same spot in Logic Pro. What I mean by this is when you export MIDI files from Ableton, even if you've consolidated that MIDI file from the beginning of the film to the end of the film, let's say you don't have any MIDI notes at the beginning of that film and you have some MIDI notes coming in, say, halfway through. Ableton does not recognize that you've consolidated that MIDI file, so it's only going to export like from the point of where there are MIDI notes placed in that MIDI file. So even though you've consolidated all of your MIDI files and they all line up, they all are the same length, when you export your MIDI files, they're not going to line up when you import them into Logic Pro. They're all going to be different lengths. So as you can see, they're not lining up here in Logic Pro when I start them from the beginning of the session. So that's another kind of weird issue I came across. I'm like, that's so bizarre. Like, it seems like a simple feature that Logic can do when it exports MIDI. It knows to export the whole consolidated MIDI file, not just from where the notes start. So what I had to do was to work around this issue. With every single MIDI file in my session, I had to place one note at the very start of the MIDI file, and I had to do that for every single track in Ableton. So you can imagine it was tedious because this was a really big kind of project. So I had a lot of tracks. So I had to go through and import one note at the very beginning of the MIDI file so that when I imported all of my MIDI files into Logic, they all started at the same spot. So this is my final Logic Pro session that I delivered to the orchestrator. And as you can see, all of my MIDI files have been imported and they all line up at the beginning of the project. So they all start at the same time. And this is because of that dummy note that I placed at the beginning of each MIDI file. Okay, so this brings me to limitation number 4, and that is no time code. So Ableton doesn't have like an ability to sync time code. And this is really big in the filmmaking world. So sometimes when you get given a film to score to, it's going to have a certain time code on it that needs to sync to bar 1, beat 1 of your project. Now, Ableton does not have this feature at all. And so if you have, like a film that's going to start at a certain time code, you're not going to be able to sync that to your timeline in Ableton. Okay, so let me kind of explain that again because this gets really confusing for me as well. All right, so for example, if you have a film that starts at 00450001 and you need that time code to start at bar 1, there is no way in Ableton to be able to achieve this right now without maybe using a Max for Live device, which I haven't come across yet. I know there are some timecode Max for Live devices, but I don't believe that they can sync like your film to a timecode in Ableton. If I'm wrong, like please let me know because I'd love to learn this. I'd love to learn how to sync timecode in Ableton. Whereas in Logic Pro, if you have a timecode on your film and you need to sync that to beat 1 of bar 1 in your project, you can easily achieve this. So here in Logic Pro, this is where you will sync your timecode to your bar position in your project. So this is where you can adjust the timecode of where your film starts at bar position 1. And the other great feature here in Logic Pro is where you can actually lock and unlock your SMPTE position on your timeline. And this is handy if you're changing tempos or time signatures. It will lock the SMPTE position so that your session doesn't go all out of whack and out of time. Lucky for me, I didn't have a film that needed timecode syncing because my film started at 00000000. So basically, that wasn't an issue for me. However, if I want to continue to use Ableton as my DAW of choice for composing for film, I'm going to need to learn a workaround. Now, apparently there is a manual way of working around this, which I know some professional composers who actually compose in Ableton and know the manual way to do it, which I'm going to be speaking to sometime in the new year. So once I find out the workaround to that, I'll let you guys know. But for now, just know that you can't actually do this in Ableton. So if you need a sync time code, that's going to be a big issue and limitation. But like I said, you can easily sync the time code in Logic Pro as a workaround for now. And I'm going to throw something else in here. It's not really a limitation. It was just like something that was so annoying when I was working in Ableton. Like in terms of using all of the big libraries, in terms of Contact and Complete 14, I found that Ableton constantly crashed like when I was using these libraries. So yeah, I just found that to be a really kind of annoying like thing that would happen, which kind of like hindered my workflow and like productivity because when you're dealing with your program crashing all the time, it's like a lot of time wasted in terms of like getting the program back up and running and things like that. So that was just something weird that I experienced while composing in Ableton as well, was the, constant crashing of the program, not being able to handle like large amounts of third party, like cinematic orchestral libraries. So yeah, that was something that, was really disappointing as well. So yeah, so that's basically how I compose in Ableton Live 12. Like that was some of my workarounds to the limitation of using Ableton as a scoring, I guess, software DAW for film. Let me know if you've come across any other limitations in a comment below. I'd be interested to know what you came across, if you've used Ableton for film scoring, what kind of limitations you came across, and also what your workaround was. It would be very interesting to know and learn because I do definitely want to keep using Ableton. It's something that I've used for 10 years. So I don't really want to go and learn another DAW just to be able to compose for film in a professional environment and setting. Yeah, hopefully, it's something in the future that Ableton could consider for composers, because there are professional composers out there wanting to use Ableton and are limited with just simple features like this that Logic Pro has, and other doors like I believe Cubase and other scoring doors specific to film scoring have. So it would be great to have these features incorporated into the next update in Ableton. It would it would make film composing like so much easier, because I want to stick in Ableton. I love Ableton. I have spent a lot of time learning Ableton. It's the DAW that I'm the most comfortable with. I love the sound design like features and the ability to, sound design, in ways that you just can't do in other DAWs. So I've invested my time in Ableton. I want to stick with Ableton. So I really hope that Ableton can give us film composers some of these features in the future. But I hope you have enjoyed this video, and I hope you've gotten something out of it. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next video.